voices that sometimes aren't have that as a way in, and also to bring in voices that sometimes aren't vocal. That's a weird way to say it. All right. Before I start, I'm going to try not to get up and lecture. I'm just going to try to speak not for you, but for me. Any questions about the class? This came up in some separate conversations. With respect to where there are a couple of practical matters. With respect to the final, what I normally set as the deadline for submission is the Monday of finals week. I'd have to double check what day that is, May 11th or 12th, something like that. Looks like it's it looks like it's May 11th. So let's confirm that. Graduate students often have the option of taking an incomplete. That's up to all of you. I would just caution you that if you do that, try not to let it linger. I've had graduate students who have never completed their incomplete, and I've always been a little unclear about the consequences of that. It was a problem for when I was a graduate student, so I'm aware of it, and also because they nearly stopped my funding because when I submitted something only a very short time after incomplete, my professor didn't grade it for another year and a half. I forget what it was, so I thought I had done more. It led to a big mess. So please keep that in mind. If you want to discuss what you have in mind, you can do that with me. But the scope is broad for the graduate courses. I'd rather that the class serve your interests than the other way around. And but what I would need to just see is that somehow there was a relevance, like a fairly strong relevance for our discussions and in the class. Any questions about that? And annotated bibliography is an option if people want to do that. And it can be one in which you do a thematic annotated bibliography where you choose specific readings, where you don't have to do everything, but you'd have to do whatever was relevant to that theme, and conversely, that theme would have to be relevant enough to the sources. Zishi, by the way, I finished your first. We can talk about it tomorrow. All right, so.
So any pages limitations?
I mean, the limitations, yeah. I mean, I would say try to keep it under 30 pages if you can, double spaced. But it's not going to make so. The guideline tends to be 20 to 30 pages, but that obviously has to vary, given the scope of what you do, given the form of what you do, and so on. Any other questions or concerns? Okay, so, and just so you know, I'm not going to grade them. This is something that again, as a graduate student, happened in some of my classes. I am not going to grade them as though you're submitting something for a journal. That just doesn't make sense to me for a lot of different reasons. And one of the biggest reasons being that if any of you have dealt with peer review, often the first round of peer review is nasty. So if that were the model, it's like, okay, so everyone should get a low grade, and then you have to revise once, twice over, and so on. Though I did have one well-known professor brag. I think I can't tell what humble brag, is that the expression, about how he gave us a paper that had been his one instance of having a revise and resubmit. And he published a lot, so that was saying a lot. Any case, All right. That has been, I will just say, very far from my experience. Okay, so I'm going to move to this week's readings. I'm not quite sure how long I'll take. That sort of also depends, but feel free to interrupt me, but I want to get through some thoughts. The reason that I want to do this is that though we've seen some historical work, this is the first week in which it was all history, but of a particular kind, and I want to make that clear, right? None of the histories that we looked at were microhistories. None of the histories that we looked at were primarily nation-based histories, right? A lot of them generally were, and even if they had names like Maros Chakras or like Darwin and Arabic, they actually are elements that are far broader than the Middle East, and in the context, this is a question of people choosing titles for various reasons. So in a certain way, there have been changing trends within the discipline itself about this and about a kind of resistance to case history. So the curiosity about a lot of these texts is that they're not announced in this way. They're not announced as arguing against the short durée of looking for the long durée again. They are not constituted as though they're polemic. Right? There are polemics about the irrelevance of history that confines itself to a few years in one particular national site, right? These texts generally aren't interested in this, and this is one of the questions. The reason that this matters for us is that in a certain sense, they find a way to make some of their questions legible by taking a longer the right? So something that runs through them is this question of making visible the historical and cultural conditions for certain kinds of narratives. This is, again, a number of you focused on elements that we will return to. Right now, I'm not ignoring what you wrote in your, and some of it will be consonant with it, but in any case, for Broda, for example, there's a very specific question, right? For Broda, as well as for, let's say, Augstein, there's a very, actually, maybe I should just say this sort of specific questions that are animating all through really quickly, right? For Broda, how is it that so many modern narratives are structured around what is imagined to be a historical story about the sons of Noah and the degree to which that is linked to the constitution of human difference in the West? For Augstein, it is what on earth explains the Caucasian hypothesis and its circulation. It's a little trickier for Rudwick and for Chakre, but for Rudwick, for both of them, they actually share a presentist moment, which is something like the puzzle over how it is that scientific and non-scientific narratives are imagined to be in conflict, and how to explain that in different ways, right? And so in each instance, they are looking to so they're, in a certain sense, a kind of puzzle animates all of them. And a puzzle that relates to a kind of long-term narrative that, oddly enough, or not so oddly, requires them to look at a kind of longue durée history. I'm only speaking in very broad strokes right now. There are details of this. And I will also add, I'm uncomfortable with moves in all of these papers, right? That's generally true of everything I read, but I just want to make that clear insofar as you might imagine that these histories are some sort of flat tellings on a factual basis, right? So what, if you like, a kind of sort of let's begin with Broada. Is this okay for me to do this?
Yeah.
There's part of what, if you like, to answer his question, the puzzle he sets out is to examine the degree to which certain sorts of geographical imaginaries coupled with cartographic technologies help to establish the possibility of the kind of Noachic, the future Noachic story. Part of what he's pointing out, so that's one side of it. Part of what he's pointing out is you do not operate in much of at least the European scene with anything like the geographic imaginary that could possibly associate the sons of Noah with the different geographies that exist now. The cartographies are radically different. Though he leans into it at times, this isn't about right or wrong, right? This isn't about more knowledge making something explosive, as a couple of people pointed out. It's often about the different affordances of the different geographical senses linked to the different technologies and representations thereof. The other technology that he focuses on, and there's a kind of almost puzzle that he puts in, is the question of which, as he himself says, a lot of people prior to him published on, is the idea of the printing press. But for him, and he does do this content versus non-content distinction, but for him, the Bible as a book becomes a kind of technology, and a technology that condenses, that forces a particular kind of circuiting of interpretations in reference to it, even when people have not read it, which is the majority of people, even now, right? So that there's still only often an imagination of what the Bible is saying, rather than what the Bible is saying. Nevertheless, he argues that it works to constrain the breadth of interpretations that you have in the Middle Ages. Likewise, let's shift to Augstein. In a way, right, from a sort of chronological perspective, she almost, in a kind of funny way, takes off from where Broada largely leaves off, right? In her puzzle of how it is that, at least in the United States, the Caucasian hypothesis had the kind of purchase it did have and still has. So that to the degree to which it is still one of the operative categories for the constitution of human difference, formal and informal in this country. Part of what she is looking at is the degree to which a change in scriptural reading practices, coupled with the existence of references to particular kinds of stabilized texts, informs the possibility of linking an origin of peoples to a particular region. The texts become elevated to such an extent that you can speak both of a constrained human difference and a dispersion that takes place. In other words, the scriptures are read to be, in effect at this point, to look for evidence to say there are only so many groups of people, there are only so many places they could have come from. This already in this period, it should be clear. So this is Enlightenment era, late 18th century, is where a lot of her action, and early 19th century happens. There's already a difficulty in distinguishing between whatever we might call the scientific and whatever we might call theological, natural historical, natural philosophical. This is a moment where it's very hard to simply impose in retrospect, those categories. And this is important because, like, what happens thereafter, after you have people like Blumenbach and then Cuvier, which are maybe her two largest figures, produce their sort of natural history. What you have is the emergence of then what are taken to be and named, this will be important in a different way for the but named scientific history, scientific racisms, where racism doesn't have the connotation it has now, right? So that you are telling a story in the 19th century that is predicated on the respectability, if you like, of Blumenbach and Cuvier. And she tells, right, a twisted tale, right? But it's not just the contingency of the specifics of the tale that matter, right? It's the formations that follow on something like Broada's formations, where you can have large-scale disciplinary shifts in particular kinds of scriptural reading practices, where you can have as particular forms of agendas across disciplines in the late 18th and perhaps especially in the early 19th century to talk about human difference through the lens of dispersion. Right? Whether you're talking about classical civilization and its emergence, whether you're talking about anthropological, linguistic studies, whatever it may be. Can I keep going? Or is this? There is also a shift that she notes that enables, that might sound like a curiosity, and maybe in a certain sense she takes it as a curiosity. But that sort of signals if you like, to risk overstating it, signals a large inflection point in the ways in which chronological narratives are constituted that are attempting to be cosmological. And this is focused on the question of beauty, right? And what might seem like this curiosity of Blumenbach's, and I haven't returned to the text, so feel free to correct me, just because the density of the week turned out to not allow me to do this, but I taught these several times before. What happens is in Blumenbach's Golgotha, or in these skulls, right? He chooses the most beautiful one and he links it to the Caucasian region. This is partly what produces the Caucasian hypothesis and the term. That might sound cute, or it might sound like an idiosyncrasy, but actually, as Augustine points out, but perhaps needs to be emphasized all the more, it's linked to a decline narrative, right? That was very broadly circulating, and again, beyond the West, which in effect says, God created the world. We don't often care when God created the world, right? And so on. But when God created the world and created, let's say, if he created a first garden in whatever denomination or whatever religion you would have, what he created were the most beautiful specimens, because what else would God do? And what has happened over time is decline. Beauty then becomes a sign of antiquity or even originality. So that beauty signals coming closer to God's prototype. And this is partly what grounds the Blumenbachian narrative, right? Cuvier, as you see, radically transforms this, right, in a number of ways. And in a certain sense, shares that narrative, and in a certain sense, undoes it from within, partly by focusing on catastrophic change. if we wanted to, we could tell a tale of the significance, which is not minor, of people like Cuvier to people like Lamarck, of Lamarck and Cuvier to Darwin, and so on. There's an enormous historical scholarship on this, sorry, just to be clear. And that's not what we're doing now. All right, so then broader places within these moments, the kind of purchase that the Caucasian hypothesis ultimately starts having for cueing particular kinds of what we retrospectively call scientific agendas. So they might have in their day been called natural historical or natural philosophical. All right. Embedded within this sort of large period, oh, sorry, the laughter is really funny. So let me just close the door. Is this useful? I mean, I'm doing it. All right. It's partly to explain why I gave what might seem like very detailed texts and so on. So I don't want the broad strokes to be missed, and I would also understand that it's not terribly unlikely that there was some skimming, right, at various points. All right, so the Rudwick embeds himself, if you like, in that large chronological period. He doesn't think of it in these terms, of this way, that we see between Brahe and Einstein, moving it up to the future. And in this, Brahe and Einstein actually naturally produce something that they don't underscore more, which is the degree to which, if we cared about questions of secularization, which we've been talking about somewhat on this arm, the degree to which the narratives, the scientific narratives that get produced later on are built on religious narratives. This is something, by the way, that El-Shukri, a point that El-Shukri makes, where for El-Shukri's actors, I'll say this in passing, this is more self-conscious. The scientific actors at times treat, especially as you move from the 19th to the 20th century, treat themselves as something like a tabula rasa, as though they can approach the question of the history of the universe as though it had never been approached before, the question hadn't been asked, and that the question somehow presents itself by nature. For El-Shukri's actors, so I'm going to actually put in El-Shukri before, but I'll do El-Shukri, brought it back to El-Shukri. For El-Shukri's actors, there are different agendas for the assimilation of both Darwinian and Spencerian narratives. She doesn't say this enough in the introduction, but Herbert Spencer, a sociologist, is an extremely important figure. And in this instance, in the work that they do, she also does some of this work in the context of China and Japan, but not in the pure materials that we see. The work they do is to knowingly put the texts that they want to recommend from Darwin and Spencer into conversation with older texts. The surprising part, and El-Shukri might sound a little bit like she's saying at a particular moment, they do this and that's surprising. That's not how I read her. What it reads is there are reasons which we can get to that recommend these narratives globally, to use the term with caution, and that she's focusing on those historical actors who want to find ways or strategies for their adoption, right? And sometimes with sincerity, sometimes saying these are indeed, to the extent that people can tell, these are indeed the narratives we've been telling, right? But they operate in different keys that promise futurity, power, so on. Coming back to the Rudwick. For Rudwick is operating in a period that when he's speaking to, like he writes this at a moment in which though he's not American, there's a kind of American specificity to this, of a kind of clash between the sciences and especially evolution at the moment that he's writing. And so he is, in a number of ways, thinking that a lot of the actors to which he's speaking to in the intervention that he's making are unaware of the degree to which the modern scientific and even evolutionary histories have built upon particular forms of what thereafter get referred to as scriptural histories. So that he has a point to make to them. Even though he ultimately does not accept a convergence hypothesis, he ultimately, I think this is a point Donna made, that he ultimately accepts a kind of cosmological conflict hypothesis on some level. He nevertheless says that the sort of the cosmologies that are in production are indebted to the same roots. Mm-hmm. All right, so from this perspective, when we did the work earlier in the semester to look at narratology and to point to, if we took seriously the kind of narratology that we get from someone like Chapman, we would see the difficulty of treating, for example, different cosmological narratives as similar, right? Despite Rudwick's point about sort of cosmological ambitions, a lot of his work demonstrates why it might be so easy to treat the scientific and the non-scientific narratives as mutually coherent. They all presume that there's a stadial quality to history, that we can speak in terms of stages of particular periods. And in fact, his shapes and those diagrams that he draws are largely something that he thinks of as chronological distensions. That it's not difficult to move from secular to non-secular keys in speaking about how they operate together. This perhaps comes back to a point that I saw Zachary making. And a question arises here of the degree to which, and it's a question that we've seen before in Lotman and seen before even in Chapman and others, of the degree to which what's happening is a kind of historical accident in which it's kind of stunning that there's, if you like, a similar structure in large terms to these narratives, or indeed there's something inbuilt about human cognition that constructs particular kinds of stories in this way. We'll come back to that in a minute. Is this still helpful? Sorry, it's going to take me a bit more time. Okay. Yeah, let me hold off one point. Sorry, I'm going in about 5 different directions in my head and I want to settle down. All right, let me come back to, let me try to say okay. So one of the things that they are also diagnosing, now this is both El-Shukri and Rudwick, is the degree to which there is nevertheless a contestation, there's a felt intervention that's being made that presumes a kind of purification is necessary on all sides. That to say that a narrative, for many scientists, to say something about a narrative having religious roots is an accusation, or some sort of demonstration of the impossibility of the new, or some kind of undercutting of the truth that they're after, and so on. For the religious, it is often saying something that pushes the idea that somehow they have to accept the scientific interpretation, that their own interpretations are parasitic on them, that they don't have a modernity without it, and so on. Am I being clear? So that there's sort of resistance on all sides, and they're both attempting in a certain way, almost sometimes by not speaking it, though it comes out at particular points, to find a kind of route through this. Whether it's with ultimately focusing on the cosmological ambitions of modern natural history that operates behind its back in a number of ways, or by looking to circulation hypotheses that don't spend too much time on where the origins of the circulation and where the destinations of the circulations go. Right. Like El-Shukri, one could ask, is she telling a similar story to the story that used to be told about Arab science as being the kind of Arab and Muslim science as being simply the space for containing ancient Greek science until the Europeans could rediscover it and then make it flower. Right? That was an extraordinarily dominant narrative, even into my lifetime. Right? In fact, I was taught by that narrative. So you could ask, is El-Shukri doing something similar with respect to the question of the evolutionary narratives by seeming to make them coming out of Darwin? That's a much, much more complicated story that requires also studying more of her work and the intellectual histories that she examines. In large part, I would say the answer is no. And part of her work is, in fact, destabilizing if we've seen, she writes another paper which she cites, When Did Science Become Western? Right? And so this is also part, and this is part of the work of the introduction to seed, part of the large question also of destabilizing what counts as scientific and what counts as non-scientific work is to ask, when did the modern concept of science take place? This is specifically indexed in this text. She does this in two ways. One is somewhat quietly. When did I think I've asked you all of this the question, when did the modern word scientist get coined? It was in the 1830s. Right? So it was in the midst of this kind of work. And it was again a term that was coined to signal that a new term was needed because of so much disagreement over what natural research of what this kind of work was. What's more, for El-Shukri, what becomes extraordinarily important is the rise of positivism, but where positivism is understood as social science. So this is Kantian positivism, Kant as in, because some Americans pronounce the M, right? But it's this, Kant. But it's pronounced more like almost like an N sound, just in my hearing. And so there is a focus on them as sort of foundational sociologists, people who construct the new category for science of society. And this positivism was understood as anti-metaphysical and the possibility of a new kind of form. Both of them tell stadial histories of the world. And both of them say that we need to apply a new form of science, both to get rid of metaphysics, cosmological thought, and to give a kind of descriptive basis. Now thinking Winter, and the language of description is very much their description for what we can now say about human interactions. The reason this matters is it also helps to start explaining the importance of evolutionary narratives more generally, of the idea that some societies are linked more to future than others, and that one sees this by establishing the category of society as a kind of comparative scientific tool or technique. This comes out much, much more in work in this book, but elsewhere. In this regard, by the way, unlike Darwin, Spencer is consulted by everyone, right? And is seen as almost a kind of figure for thinking about political thought and empire generally. And is one of the people, he's the one who coins survival of the fittest. He's the person who sometimes people link to social Darwinism, and tries to draw the lessons of evolution to social structure generally. He's not the only one, and there are more complicated stories to be told. All right. I'm still talking and I've been talking. I need at least another 15 minutes. Do you want a break? Because is that all right? Is this okay, or how are you all feeling?
All good.
All right, honestly, this is taking me longer than I thought. I looked at the time and I was like, oh my God, I can't believe it. But I really want, the reason I'm doing this is it almost felt unfair to me that I just plunged you into historical texts and didn't say something about the point, and I don't know how else, from my perspective. After this, I hope that it will just go with all of your perspectives. All right. All right, so another thing that I want us to think about, and maybe I can do more like 10 minutes. Okay. In a certain way, I'm really just going to let me like, okay. Keep in mind, right, regardless of our theorizations of narrative, whether or not they're structural narrative, whether or not they're narrative acts, whatever it may be, the texts overall as a whole points to this kind of commitment, this broad sort of commitment to produce a narration of the world that's predicated on a certain amount of contained diversity that establishes a beginning and an end, as long as with also crucial pivotal middle points. There's very little that challenges this. And it becomes so naturalized that it becomes by the 20th century, an agenda of the modern sciences to relate a history. This is also puzzling from the certain perspective from someone like Hayden White's point of view, right? Of the question of the degree to which, right, if we tell a transhistorical tale of the sciences, if we imagine we know what the sciences are, do we imagine that at times they spoke in chronologies, at times they spoke in annals, at times they spoke in narratives, and when they spoke in narratives, they needed political closure. They needed authority to produce it, right? As White might suggest. Or once we're focusing on quote unquote scientific narratives, do we see other structures of power and authority come? But what's more, what starts happening with respect to this story sorry, I do just have to stand up to try to say this clearly, it starts being linked to particular kinds of notions of that endpoint of the story of futurity, right? How is it that what often gets imagined are a number of things simultaneously, that the futurity of humanity as such, and this we could even ask this with respect to winter and so on, that it gets linked to, depending again on how your vision of Homo narens and depending on how you think of her as being bred, but regardless, she's not the most evident case of this. The degree to which or I should say also in terms of, just forget I said anything about winter, that gets too complicated, right? Anyway, the degree to which the tale of the future is a scientific tale, right? So that it's a scientific tale that encompasses everyone. So that's a different modality of universality. It isn't about simply saying something like we all share natural laws, that it happens to be the case that Western science has been in the lucky enough position to relate. This is that somehow we have these sciences and they are the site for our destinations. This is on a Grady level, if you like, if you forgive that term, of things like development, of technoscientific development, that's often imagined to be, well, we all know what modernity looks like. Modernity is signaled by particular kinds of shininess, potential kinds of catastrophe, potential kinds of sublime exploration, and so on. So that, but then what that contains is the futurist imaginary, right? It suddenly says there are privileged actors who can discern that future, and again, according to a narrative structure. So right away, one can ask, right, is the breadth of human experience, whatever we take it to be, such that it's given to vectors like this? This also says something about why it's so often the evolutionary, or at least the suggestive of, that it's often evolutionary interventions. So we'll see this if we stick with our readings, and we'll talk about it at the end, that a lot of futurist science, so if we looked at 19th century historical sciences and its commitments, and we see already in El-Shakri this kind of idea that also the evolutionary sciences might be key to the future, you see this amplified in the 20th century when people imagine that evolutionary sciences will give us ways in which we can reshape our heredity and reshape our bodies. And then what that means then for the future of humanity as such. Right? So then, and so, if we can say this uncritically, for a number of people, the technosciences are the future. They just simply are the future. And you sound like, like a fool if you say otherwise. Or you sound like other historically problematic terms like a Luddite, right? Even though that may not be the nature of your concern. Okay, one last set of points and then I stop. There is a question that has to be asked here, right? Especially if we look at people like later on, like Quentin Meillassoux and various kinds of thinkers, of the degree to which if we take the sciences seriously and their own cautions, that if we are forced to consider the evolutionary hypotheses or dispersion hypotheses or any of these narratives as hypothetical, what does that mean about when we speak about the question of our own philosophical considerations right now in relation to the nature of everything, right? To our own cosmologies. So we've seen in passing, so here, the narrow way that this confronts us in this class is again the simple question of, does the universe actually operate according to the logic of a narrative? Just a simple question. From this perspective, we will see, like in people like Meillassoux, it can almost be taken as, it's of course established that there are historical fossil evidence that somehow speaks to an inhuman time, right? This is not the thrust of what he's saying. This is a kind of long precursor to where he's going. And in fact, he's more interesting to us or to me in what he does with the mathematical narratives that we talked about. But that's another story. Right now, I want to focus on him only as an example of something. This doesn't just evade the question of the anthropological or zoomorphical nature of time, right? Whether or not time is ours or time is something that in which we flow as everyone else does. It's not just to ignore other philosophical traditions, some of which are contemporary, like the block universe tradition, that does come people like Hugh Price that do say things like time is for us, right? That if properly understood, if we could take something like a non-human perspective, we might find that everything is, we couldn't speak of either synchronicity or flow. But there's also a way in which it ignores, and we'll come back to the question of history of science, the degree to which it took all of this work to produce the idea of of a kind of set of scientific agendas that told nature in terms of a kind of historical tale. And then we come right back to Lyotard. How is it that we say that sciences are largely have exercised themselves of narrative when so many of their logics of historical narratives and logics and ambitions permeate particular aspects of the sciences? And is that fair? It also likewise, if one is to say, it also likewise ignores, it's not just that it ignores history of science, which is one of the problems, it ignores the wildness of science. So, if you'll forgive that term. So for example, in the 20th century, for a lot of the 19th century, you could not reconcile, if you tried to tell chronologies in terms of the physical sciences and the biological sciences and geographical sciences, they collided. They were not reconcilable. So that different sciences propose different ages. The shift starts to take place in the early 20th century in a number of different ways. Some people put it down to the question of the discovery of radiation, but it's a much more complicated story. Even then, for a large part, there were times in which, before people consolidated around the question of the age of how you determine the age of stars, there seemed to be stars that were older than the universe. And some of the scientific responses to that were, oh, well, maybe age is just too human a concept, right? We should not worry about this. That was one of the stances. Others took it as a contradiction, right? So we also ignore the diversity of the possibilities of response like this. This is putting away the degree to which there are other kind of arguments over the nature of things, like what people often take to be absolute necessities, like, as I mentioned before, entropy, or what the meaning of the multi-universes are, if you believe them, and their own conceptions of temporality, and whether or not we are after the fact simulations, right? Or as you might have seen if you didn't have a chance to read some of the science fiction materials that I gave you, but then focused on the sciences, the Gufka, the degree to which some scientists could seriously say maybe we're somebody's zoo, right? So that the world is truly can't operate according to the extrapolations that we imagine. And then we come right back to the questions of 19th century science. All right, I'm gonna stop talking. I'm just, all of that was to try to speak to a number of ways in which these speak to some of our concerns, not in the most urgent ways. I know these are not materials that speak to everybody here, right? I took that as a given. And what I just said also doesn't speak to all of you. But it speaks to the larger question of the degree to which, if we are questioning the interrelation of narrative and science, these are materials that from my perspective are hard to ignore. And they are often ignored in trying to say something about how science is essentially not narrative. Okay? Or bracketed, if you like. All right, since I spoke so much, do you want to break now, or should we move to your own? What I would propose is we whether we take the break now or not, we start with Zeshi's reading post, and then we just open up the conversation from there. Mm-hmm. Is that okay? Yeah. So what do you think? Do you want to break? A short break, like 5 minutes, and we can take a second break? Sure. All right, but then truly, please come back in 5 minutes. All right, so 10:15.
They have a coffee at the one with the undergrad
I just got kind of urgent email.
No, I was like a week ago.